There are nights a man rehearses an entire speech in his head before he ever opens his mouth, and this was one of them. Daniel Hayes sat in the third row of his daughter's school auditorium, his dress shirt still wrinkled from a 12-hour workday, his tie loosened just enough to let him breathe. His phone rested face down on his knee, and he kept it there on purpose, because he had made a decision that afternoon that he was not entirely sure he could defend. At 4 o'clock, his calendar had pinged with a quarterly strategy meeting, the one his boss, Mr. Calloway, had circled and underlined and mentioned twice in the hallway. At the very same time, on a slip of construction paper taped to his refrigerator, his 7-year-old daughter Lily had drawn a stick figure in a tutu, and the words "My First Recital" in careful, looping letters. He had stood in his office cubicle, staring at both the email and the memory of that drawing, and something in his chest had simply refused to choose the meeting. Now the house lights dimmed, and a hush rolled over the rows of parents like a tide going out. The amber stage light bloomed across the empty boards, and then there she was, so small, so impossibly small from where he sat, her pink tutu catching the light like the petal of some rare flower. He felt his throat tighten before she had taken a single step. She found her mark, lifted her chin the way her dance teacher must have taught her, and waited for the music with a seriousness that made him want to laugh and cry at the same time. He did not pick up his phone. He did not check whether Calloway had emailed asking where he was. For 3 full minutes, the only thing in the world was that little girl moving through her steps, sometimes a half beat behind the music, sometimes turning the wrong way and correcting herself with a determined little hop. And every single one of those imperfect moments was, to him, more valuable than anything that could have been decided in that conference room. He had missed so much already. He thought about the late nights, the dinners reheated at 9, the bedtime stories told over speakerphone while he sat in traffic. He thought about the year her mother left, when the silence in the apartment had been so loud he could hear his own heartbeat, and how Lily had crawled into his lap one evening and asked if he was going to leave too. He had promised her he never would. Watching her now, twirling under the lights with her tongue poking out in concentration, he understood that a promise like that was not made in a single sentence. It was made in choices, in moments exactly like this one, in being in the seat instead of the meeting. When she finished her routine and stood frozen in her final pose, the whole auditorium clapped, and he clapped harder than anyone, his hands stinging, his eyes shining, his pride so enormous it felt like it might lift him out of the folding chair entirely. She scanned the crowd, searching, and when she found his face, she broke into a grin so wide it crinkled her whole face, and she waved with both hands like she was trying to flag down a rescue plane. He waved back, mouthing the words, "Good job, sweetheart." And in that exchange across the dim and crowded room, nothing else mattered. Not the unread emails, not the empty chair in the conference room, not whatever Mr. Calloway might say tomorrow. There was only his daughter, lit gold from above, beaming at the one person in the audience she had been dancing for all along, and a tired father who had chosen, finally, to simply be there. Afterward, in the long fluorescent corridor outside the auditorium, the families scattered into little knots of laughter and flash photography, mothers fixing collars and grandfathers handing over wilting bouquets bought from the gas station. Daniel found Lily near the trophy case, still in her ballet costume, her pink tutu slightly crushed from all the hugging that had already happened, her cheeks flushed pink to match. The moment she saw him push through the crowd, she dropped the little paper flower she'd been clutching and ran at him full speed, her ballet slippers slapping against the polished floor, and he barely had time to crouch before she launched herself up and wrapped both arms around his neck. He closed his eyes and held her, really held her, the way you hold something you almost let slip away. The golden corridor lights glowed warm behind them, throwing soft halos along the cinderblock walls, and for a moment he just breathed her in. The smell of hairspray and the faint cherry of the lip balm she'd insisted on borrowing. the warmth of her small body still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of being on a stage for the first time in her life. "Daddy," she whispered into his collar, "did you see me? Did you see the part where I spun all the way around?" He laughed, and the laugh came out shaky. "I saw every second of it," he told her. "I saw the spin, and the curtsy, and the little jump at the end. You were perfect." She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, her brow furrowed with the seriousness only a 7-year-old can summon. "I messed up the second turn," she said gravely, as if confessing a crime. "I went the wrong way." And he shook his head and brushed a stray strand of hair off her forehead. "Sweetheart," he said, "I have watched a lot of dancers in my life, and not one of them ever danced as brave as you did up there tonight. You went the wrong way for half a second, and then you found your way right back. That's not a mistake. That's the most important thing a person can ever learn how to do." She considered this with the solemnity of a tiny judge, then decided it was acceptable and buried her face back in his shoulder. Around them, the other parents were already heading for the doors, jingling car keys, calling for siblings who had wandered off toward the vending machines. A few of them nodded at Daniel as they passed, the polite acknowledgement of strangers who share the same small orbit of school pickups and parent-teacher nights. And he nodded back, but he didn't let go of his daughter. Not yet. Not for any of them. He thought about how empty that conference room must have felt without him in it, how Calloway had probably scanned the seats and registered the absence with that flat, unreadable expression of his. He thought about it, and then he let the thought drift away, because Lily was tugging at his tie now and asking if they could get ice cream on the way home. And the simple math of that request, a little girl and a tired father and a scoop of vanilla, made the rest of the world feel very far away and very unimportant. He stood lifting her with him, her legs swinging, her crown of fabric flowers tilting sideways on her head. "One scoop," he said, "and only because you were a star." She cheered, and the sound echoed down the golden hallway, and he carried her out into the cool evening air, with no idea at all that the next morning would bring a phone call that would test everything he believed about the choice he had just made. Morning came the way it always did, in that small apartment, slow and blue and quiet, with the kind of light that filters through cheap curtains and turns everything the color of a hell breath. Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, still in the t-shirt he'd slept in, a half-drunk cup of coffee going lukewarm beside his elbow. Lily was still asleep down the hall, exhausted from her big night. Her costume hung carefully over the back of a chair where he'd placed it after she'd finally drifted off mid-sentence in the car. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant sound of someone's morning television, bleeding through the wall. He had not slept well. He'd lain awake, replaying the recital, smiling at the ceiling, and then somewhere around 2 in the morning, the smile had curdled into worry, the way joy so often does for a man who has spent years learning to expect the other shoe to drop. He had picked up his phone 3 times before the sun rose. Now he held it in both hands, staring at the screen, where a single notification sat waiting for him like a stone in his stomach. One new voicemail, received at 7:42 a.m. From a number he knew by heart, Mr. Calloway. His boss did not leave voicemails. In 4 years at the company, Daniel could count on one hand the times Calloway had called instead of sending one of his clipped 3-word emails, and every one of those calls had been bad news. He set the phone down. He picked it up again. He turned it over in his hands like a man trying to decide whether to read a letter he already suspects will end something. The truth was that they could not afford for him to lose this job. The math of their life was tight, painfully tight, stretched thin across rent and groceries, and the modest tuition for the dance class that lit Lily up the way nothing else did. He thought about that class, about how much it cost, and about the cruel irony that the very thing he had skipped work to support might now be the reason he couldn't afford to keep her in it. His thumb hovered over the screen. He thought about his father, a man who had never missed a day of work in 30 years, and had also never once watched Daniel play a single baseball game, had never sat in a folding chair under amber lights, and clapped until his hands stung. He thought about the cold, practical wisdom his father would have offered. You provide for them. Son, that's what a father is. The providing is the love. And Daniel had believed that for a long time, had built his whole identity around being a provider, a reliable man, a steady paycheck. But last night, something had shifted in him. Last night he had learned that there was a different kind of providing. One that couldn't be measured in dollars. One that lived in the look on a little girl's face when she found her father's eyes in a crowd. He just didn't know yet whether the world was going to let him afford both kinds at once. He took a long breath. He looked down the hallway toward Lily's door, half open, the costume glowing faintly in the gray light. Then he steeled himself, raised the phone to his ear, and pressed play on the voicemail. Bracing for the sound of a voice that held his family's future in its hands, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, his coffee forgotten, the whole quiet apartment seeming to lean in and listen along with him. Before the message finished playing, his eyes drifted down to the table, to the thing he had set there the night before, and could not bring himself to throw away. It was the recital program, a single sheet of paper folded in half, made by the school's parent volunteers, and run off on a copier that had clearly been low on toner. The edges were already slightly crumpled from where Lily had clutched it in her fist all the way home, refusing to let it go even as she fell asleep. He picked it up now with his weathered hands that had spent 20 years gripping steering wheels and stapling reports and signing forms, and he held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that means more than its weight. On the cover, a child had drawn a clumsy flower in crayon, and inside, in a list of names typed in a font too large for the space, he found her. Lily Hayes, Spring Petals Routine, third from the top. He ran his thumb over her name. There was something about seeing it printed there, official, public, real, that made the whole night feel permanent in a way that memory alone never could. This had happened. She had stood on a stage, and her name had been printed on a program, and her father had been in the audience to see it. No voicemail could take that away. No meeting, no boss, no quarterly strategy session could reach back into last night and erase the fact of it. As Calloway's recorded voice murmured on in his ear, Daniel found himself only half listening, his attention pulled instead to this fragile paper artifact, resting on the warm cream tablecloth in the soft morning light. He thought about all the programs his own parents had never kept, the report cards and certificates and small milestones of a childhood that had passed mostly unwitnessed. He thought about how a person becomes, over the years, a museum of the things other people chose to remember about them, and how he wanted to be the curator of every single thing about his daughter's life. The crooked tooth she lost last spring, which he'd taped into a little notebook. The first time she'd ridden her bike without training wheels, captured shakily on his phone while he ran alongside her shouting encouragement. The drawings, dozens of them, taped to walls and refrigerators, and the corner of his computer monitor at work. And now this program. He smoothed the crumpled edge with his thumb, trying to flatten it back into something whole. Outside the window, a bird was singing, somewhere in the bare branches, and the blue light was slowly warming into gold as the sun cleared the rooftops across the street. He realized his hands were trembling slightly, and he wasn't entirely sure if it was from the coffee or the fear or the strange, overwhelming tenderness that had been welling up in him since the moment Lily had run down that hallway and into his arms. He set the program down gently, propping it against the napkin holder, so it stood upright, displayed, honored. Whatever Calloway was saying, whatever consequence was coming, he made himself a quiet promise in that moment. He would not regret it. He had spent enough of his life regretting the things he'd missed for the sake of being responsible. He would not add last night to that pile. He would keep this little paper program forever, and someday when Lily was grown and gone and living a life of her own, he would take it out of whatever box he kept it in, and he would remember the night he chose the recital over the meeting, and he would know with absolute certainty that he had chosen right. The voicemail clicked to its end, He lowered the phone, slowly, and stared at it. And for a long moment, he simply sat there, processing the words he had just heard. What Calloway had actually said took a moment to fully land, and when it did, Daniel let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since 7 o'clock the night before. He needed to share it with someone, and there was only one person in the world he wanted to tell. By the time Lily padded out of her room in her socks, rubbing her eyes, still wearing the t-shirt, she'd slept in, but having somehow reattached her crown of fabric flowers to her tangled hair, he had a fresh idea forming in his mind. He scooped her up, carried her to the edge of his unmade bed, and they sat there together in the warm pool of lamplight, both of them still half in last night's clothes, his coat draped over his shoulders because he'd been too distracted to take it off, and her tiny coat zipped crooked because she'd insisted on putting it on herself. He pulled out his phone, and instead of showing her any messages, he opened the camera roll. And there they were, the photos and videos from the recital, dozens of them. "Look," he said, "you want to see yourself dance." Her whole face lit up, and she scooted closer, pressing her warm shoulder against his arm, her flower crown tickling his cheek. They scrolled through them together, laughing softly so they wouldn't break the quiet of the morning. There was the blurry one where she was mid-spin, just a streak of pink. There was the one where she'd struck her final pose, arms flung wide, chin lifted, looking for all the world like a tiny professional. There was a video and she gasped when he played it, watching herself with the rapt attention children reserve only for footage of themselves, narrating her own performance, under her breath. "That's where I went the wrong way," she whispered, pointing. "And then I fixed it, see? I fixed it." He nodded, his arm around her. "You fixed it like a champion," he said. And then, because he could not hold it in any longer, he told her the secret, the thing the voicemail had said. "You know that meeting I had yesterday, the one I missed so I could come watch you?" She nodded slowly, her eyes wide because he had explained to her at bedtime. In the gentlest terms he could, that Daddy had skipped something important at work, to be there, and she had absorbed it with the quiet worry children carry when they sense an adult has made a sacrifice on their behalf. "Well," he said, "my boss called this morning," and Lily's small face clouded over instantly, her lower lip pushing out, certain she had gotten her father in trouble. But Daniel smiled and squeezed her tight. "He wasn't mad," he said softly. "He told me something I didn't expect," and he held that little secret between them for one more delicious moment, the two of them leaning together in the lamplight, conspirators in a private joy that belonged to nobody else in the world. And he would tell her the whole of it in a minute. For now, he just wanted to sit here, in this quiet, warm room, with his daughter pressed against his side and a phone full of photographs of the best night they'd had in a long time, the morning light creeping, golden across the floorboards, the rest of the world still asleep and far away. She looked up at him, her flower crown sliding down over one eyebrow, and asked, "What did he say, Daddy? What did he say?" And Daniel laughed and kissed the top of her head, and prepared to tell her the part of the story that would change the way he thought about everything, about work and worth, and what it really means to be the kind of man who stays. The whole truth of the voicemail unspooled over breakfast, and to understand it, you have to understand the days that had come before, the long string of ordinary evenings that had built quietly toward that one phone call, because the recital had not happened in a vacuum. For weeks, every night after Daniel dragged himself home from work, Lily had practiced in the living room, and he had watched her from the couch. He could see it now, replaying in his mind even as he scrambled eggs at the stove, the little girl spinning across the worn carpet of their small living room, arms out, ponytail flying, while he sat on the couch with his elbows on his knees and his chin resting in his hands, his face caught somewhere between wonder and exhaustion. Those evenings had been their whole world. He'd be so tired some nights, he could barely keep his eyes open, his back aching from a day of sitting, hunched at a desk, his mind still snarled with the day's frustrations. And then Lily would announce that it was time for rehearsal, and she'd push the coffee table out of the way with a determined little grunt, and she'd cue up her music on his old phone, and she'd dance. She danced the same 30 seconds over and over, demanding feedback after each attempt, asking, was that better? Daddy, was the spin better that time? And he would summon energy. He didn't know he had to tell her, yes, sweetheart, that one was even better than the last. He thought now about how those nights had nearly not happened, how many times he'd been asked to stay late, to take on extra projects, to be the reliable one who never said no. How easy it would have been to let those evenings slip away, one by one, to come home after she was already asleep, to become a father his daughter knew mostly as a sound at the door after dark. But somewhere along the way he had started saying no to the extra work. Quietly, without making a scene, he had started leaving at 5 so he could be home for rehearsal at 5:30. He'd told himself it was temporary, just until the recital, just for a few weeks. He hadn't realized that his colleagues had noticed, or that his quiet insistence on being home had become, in the small ecosystem of the office, a kind of quiet statement. He remembered one evening in particular near the end, when Lily had nailed the entire routine for the first time, start to finish, no mistakes. She had frozen in her final pose, and then looked at him with such hope, such naked need for his approval, that something in him had cracked wide open. He had stood up off that couch and applauded as if she were performing at a grand theater, instead of a living room with mismatched furniture and a stain on the rug from a juice spill 2 summers ago. She had run and jumped into his arms, and he had spun her around, both of them laughing, and in that moment he had understood, with total clarity, that no promotion, no bonus, no corner office could ever feel the way this felt. And he had been chasing the wrong thing for years. He realized he had thought that being a good father meant being absent in service of providing, when all along his daughter had simply wanted him there, in the room watching her spin. The eggs were ready now, and he slid them onto 2 plates, and as Lily climbed into her chair, he finally told her the rest of what Calloway had said, the words that had stunned him into silence in the blue light of dawn. And to tell that part properly, he had to first tell her about the place where it all came to a head, the office, and the long gray afternoon when he'd stood at the window, not knowing any of this was coming. Rewind. Then, to the day of the recital itself, to the late afternoon hours that Daniel had spent at the office in a state of quiet dread. He stood at the rain-streaked window on the 14th floor, watching the city blur and run beneath a gray sky. His own reflection ghosted faintly in the glass, a tired man in a wrinkled shirt staring back at him with uncertain eyes. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair where he'd thrown it that morning, and taped to the corner of his computer monitor, curling slightly at the edges, was a crayon drawing Lily had made of the 2 of them, holding hands under a yellow sun. He'd put it there months ago, and most days he barely registered it, but on this particular afternoon, he kept glancing at it, drawing strength from those 2 stick figures and their crayon smiles. The meeting was in 20 minutes. He could see through the glass walls of the conference room, across the floor, the others already beginning to gather, Calloway among them, setting up the projector, shuffling papers. Daniel's chest was tight. He had rehearsed a dozen ways to handle this. He could go to the meeting and skip the recital and tell Lily he was sorry, the way he'd told her sorry so many times before. He could go to the recital and lie about it, invent a doctor's appointment, a flat tire, anything. Or he could simply do what he was about to do, which was the hardest thing of all, tell the truth. He watched the rain trace its crooked paths down the window, and thought about all the years he had given to this company, the weekends, the missed dinners, the vacations cut short. He thought about how little of himself was left over for the one person who actually needed him. And he made his decision, standing at that window watching his own ghost in the glass. He walked across the floor to Calloway's office, and his heart was hammering, and he knocked on the open door, and when his boss looked up, Daniel said the words simply and without excuse. "Mr. Rock, Calloway, I'm going to have to miss the strategy meeting this afternoon." My daughter has her first dance recital, and I told her I'd be there, and I'm not going to break that promise." He'd braced himself for the cold stare, the clipped reply, the silence that meant trouble. Calloway had looked at him for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his weathered face, and then he had simply nodded once and said, "All right, Hayes." That was all. "All right, Hayes." And Daniel had walked back to his desk, grabbed his jacket, and left his hands shaking the whole way down in the elevator, certain he had just done something that would cost him dearly. He'd spent the entire drive to the school bracing for the fallout, imagining the email that would surely be waiting, the conversation about commitment and priorities and being a team player. He hadn't known, couldn't have known, that Calloway had stood at his own office window a few minutes later, watching Daniel cross the parking lot through the rain, hurrying toward his car, with a kind of urgency Calloway hadn't seen in him in years. He hadn't known that his boss, a man no one in the office knew much about, had a story of his own, a grown son who barely spoke to him anymore, a lifetime of meetings attended and recitals missed, a whole gallery of moments he would have given anything to have back. He hadn't known that his simple, honest refusal had reached into something in his boss that had been closed off for a very long time. He had only known the fear and the rain and the crayon drawing on his monitor and the desperate hope that he was doing the right thing as he drove away from the office and toward the warm amber lights of his daughter's stage. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over an auditorium after everyone has gone home, and somewhere in the empty school that night, long after the families had filed out into the parking lot, the custodian made his rounds and found the stage exactly as the performers had left it. The wide wooden floorboards stretched out beneath a single forgotten work light, warm and amber, and in the center of the spotlight lay a small paper flower prop, dropped by some nervous child, and never retrieved, its construction paper petals slightly bent, casting a long, thin shadow across the boards. It is worth pausing on that empty stage because it holds the secret of why nights like this matter so much. For a few minutes earlier that evening, that stage had held the entire universe of a little girl's courage. She had stood on those very boards, terrified and thrilled, and she had danced, and her father had watched. And then the music had ended, and the lights had come up, and everyone had gone home, and the magic had seemed to vanish into the ordinary air. But it hadn't vanished. That was the thing Daniel was only beginning to understand. The magic doesn't disappear when the lights go down. It lodges itself somewhere permanent in a child's growing sense of herself, in a father's understanding of what he's for. Lily would carry the memory of that stage for the rest of her life, the memory of looking out into the dark and finding her father's face, of knowing that she mattered enough for him to be there. And that memory would shape her in ways neither of them could yet see. It would be there years from now when she stood at the edge of other stages, other beginnings, other terrifying thresholds, and found the courage to step forward because somewhere deep inside her was the certainty that she was worth showing up for. That single forgotten paper flower lying in the spotlight of an empty room was a small monument to everything that had happened there. The custodian, an older man who had cleaned the school for 30 years and seen 1,000 recitals come and go, paused when he saw it. He bent down with a soft grunt and picked it up, turning it over in his hands, and he smiled to himself, a private smile, because he had raised 3 children of his own, and he knew exactly what these nights cost the parents and the audience, the rearranged schedules, the favors begged, the meetings missed. He knew because he had missed plenty of them, himself working these very floors, while his own kids performed somewhere he couldn't be. He set the paper flower carefully on the edge of the stage, where it could be found in the morning, where its small owner might come looking for it. And then he switched off the work light, and the stage went dark, and the auditorium settled into the deep quiet of an empty building at night. Somewhere across town, in a car threading through the rain-slicked streets, Daniel was driving his daughter home, neither of them knowing that their small private moment had rippled outward, that it had been witnessed, that it had touched a man at the office in a way that would surface in a voicemail the next morning. The empty stage held its silence and its single shadow, and the night wrapped around the school, and the whole world seemed to hold, just for a moment, the simple sacred truth that some choices echo far beyond the rooms in which they are made. The choice to be there, the choice to stay, the choice to let a meeting go unattended so that a little girl looking out into the dark would never have to wonder whether she was loved. To truly hold the weight of that voicemail, you have to picture one more scene, the one that happened just before the recital began, in the soft amber of the streetlight outside the school entrance at dusk. Daniel had arrived in a rush, his shirt still wrinkled, his heart still pounding from the office, and Lily had been waiting for him by the doors, with her dance teacher bouncing on her toes in her costume, her face a mixture of excitement and pure terror. When she saw him, she had run over, and he had dropped to one knee on the cold sidewalk, right there in front of everyone, and he had taken a moment to straighten her costume collar, where it had folded under itself, his big careful fingers fussing with the small fabric, both of their faces lit gold and focused and tender in the streetlight. "Dad, you came," she had whispered, and there had been a wobble in her voice, a real fear underneath it, because some part of her had not been sure he would, because she had learned in her short life that grown-ups sometimes couldn't be there even when they wanted to be. And he had looked her dead in the eye, his hand still on her collar, and he had said, "I will always come, sweetheart. Always. Do you understand me? I will always be in that audience. There is nothing in this world more important to me than watching you dance." And she had nodded, and the fear had drained out of her little face, replaced by something steadier and braver, and she had marched into that school and onto that stage and danced her heart out because her father had promised, on one knee in the streetlight, that he would always be there. That was the moment, more than any other, that Daniel had been thinking of as he listened to the voicemail the next morning. Because when Calloway's recorded voice had finally spoken, it had not said any of the things Daniel had feared. The voice had been quieter than usual, almost hesitant, stripped of its usual clipped efficiency. "Hayes," it had said, "it's Calloway. I owe you a call, and I figured this was easier than waiting until Monday. I watched you leave yesterday. I saw you run for your car in the rain to get to your daughter's recital. And I want you to know something. I have been doing this for 35 years, and in all that time, I never once left a meeting to watch my son do anything. Not once. He's grown now and we don't talk much. And I've had a long time to wonder why. You reminded me of something yesterday that I forgot a long time ago. So here's what I'm calling to say. The account's covered. I handled it. Don't worry about the meeting. And starting next month, I'm restructuring your hours. You'll be home by 5 every day. No questions asked. No penalty. I should have done it years ago. For all of you. And one more thing, Hayes." The voice had paused then and grown rougher. "Don't ever apologize for being there. For that little girl. That's the only meeting that ever really mattered. Take care of her. Goodbye." That was the voicemail. That was what had left Daniel sitting stunned in the blue light of dawn, holding a crumpled paper program, his eyes stinging, his whole understanding of his life quietly rearranging itself. He had braced for punishment and received a blessing instead. He had expected to lose something, and instead had been given back the very thing he most wanted: time, the permission to be the kind of father who kneels on cold sidewalks, to straighten costume collars, and means it when he says he will always come. Now, it was late again, a different night. And Daniel guided the car through the dark, quiet streets toward home, glancing every few moments into the rearview mirror at the small miracle asleep in the back seat. Lily had crashed completely, slumped sideways in her booster seat, still wearing her recital costume because she'd refused to change out of it, the little crown of fabric flowers slipping down over her closed eyes, her mouth slightly open, her breathing slow and deep and trusting. There was a streetlight passing rhythmically over her face, illuminating her for an instant, and then releasing her back into shadow, and each time the light fell across her, Daniel felt his chest tighten, with a love so enormous and so exhausting that it was almost more than a person could hold. He thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the meeting he'd missed, and the voicemail that had followed, and how close he had come to making a different choice, the safe choice, the responsible choice, the choice that would have left this little girl's collar uncrooked and his promise unkept. He thought about Calloway, a man he had worked beside for years without ever really knowing, and the grown son who didn't call, and the gallery of missed moments that had finally caught up with him. And he felt a wave of gratitude that his own boss's regret had become the unexpected gift that secured his daughter's evenings forever. He would be home by 5 now, every single day. He would never miss another rehearsal in that worn-out living room, never miss another recital, never miss the spin she was so proud of, or the curtsy, or the brave little correction when she found her way back after going the wrong direction. He looked at her in the mirror again, the flower crown, the costume, the absolute peace on her sleeping face, and he understood, finally and completely, what his own father had never quite grasped. The providing was not only the paycheck. The providing was this: being here, being in the audience, being the one she searched for in the dark, and always, always found. He pulled into their parking spot and shut off the engine, and for a long moment he didn't move, didn't wake her, just sat there in the dark watching his daughter sleep, the streetlight glowing soft and amber through the windshield. He thought about how someday she would be grown, how someday this costume would be folded away in a box, how someday she would stand on stages he couldn't even imagine yet, in a life that would carry her far beyond this small car and this small town. And he hoped, with everything in him, that whatever stages she stood upon, she would always carry inside her the certainty that had been planted on a cold sidewalk under a streetlight, the certainty that she was worth showing up for, that she had always been worth it, that her father had chosen her, again and again, every single time it mattered. He reached back gently and adjusted the flower crown so it wouldn't fall, and he whispered, so quietly it was almost just a breath, "I will always come, sweetheart. Always." And then he got out of the car, opened the back door, and lifted his sleeping daughter into his arms, costume and crown and all, and carried her up the stairs and into their home. This tired, ordinary, extraordinary man, this dad who stayed,